reference angles.
So before we start talking about reference angles and how to find them, we have to understand what a reference angle is. So a reference angle is the positive acute angle formed by the x-axis and terminal side of a given angle. And the terminal side is the ending side of the angle, right over here. So the reference angle would be from this side to the x-axis over here.
There are 3 things you need to know about reference angles.
Reference angles are always acute, or less than 90 degrees.
The degree measure of reference angles are always positive, just like me.
When finding reference angles, always measure to the x-axis, not the y-axis. Alright, let's take a closer look. So here we have a graph with 4 quadrants. And first we label our degrees, 0, 90, 180, 270, 360. And now we're going to break down how to find a reference angle in each of these 4 quadrants. Starting with quadrant 1. So in quadrant 1, the given angle and the reference angle are the same. And here's an example. If we draw an angle of 30 degrees, it looks like this. So now we need the distance from the terminal side here back to the x-axis over here, which also happens to be the same distance that we drew before. So it's also 30 degrees. In quadrant 1, the reference angle is the same thing as the angle that you're given. So now we're going to find an angle in the second quadrant, and we'll use 120 degrees as our example. So if this here is an angle of 120 degrees, we want to measure from our terminal side here to the x-axis over here at 180 degrees, which means this shaded area over here is our reference angle. If we know that from here to here is 180 degrees, and here to here is 120 degrees, we need the difference between the two of them to find what this measurement is over here. So we subtract our given angle, which is 120, from 180 degrees, and we get 60 degrees, which is our reference angle, and it's this measurement right here. So the rule for quadrant 2 is you take 180, you subtract your given angle, which was 120, and that'll give you your reference angle, which in this case was 60. Now we'll move on to quadrant 3. And we're going to use 180 degrees to help us find our reference angle in quadrant 3 too, just a little bit differently. So for an example, we'll use 225 degrees, and that's about what it would look like. And instead of measuring from our terminal side all the way to the x-axis over here, we have to take the shorter distance, which is back to 180 here. And so we need this difference as our reference angle. And if we know that 225 degrees goes from here to here, but 180 only goes from here to here, we need the difference between 225 and 180 to find the reference angle. So you subtract 180 from 225 and we get 45 degrees, which means that this angle here is 45 degrees. And the rule for quadrant 3 then is you take your given angle, in this case it was 225 degrees, you subtract 180 degrees and that'll give you your reference angle. In this case it was 45 degrees. So lastly we're going to try to find a reference angle in quadrant 4. And so for an example we'll use 335 degrees right here. So to find a reference angle we're going to measure from the terminal side over here to the x-axis over here at 360 degrees. And if from here all the way around here is 360 degrees, and here to here is 335 degrees, we need the difference between the two in order to find the reference angle. So we take 360, and we subtract 335 degrees, which was the angle we had, and we get 25 degrees. So the reference angle from here to here is 25 degrees. And the rule you need to remember for quadrant 4 is that you take 360 degrees, and you subtract your given angle, 335 in this case, and you'll get your reference angle, which for this one was 25 degrees. Okay, so now we're going to try a few practice problems. And the first thing you always want to remember is to label your quadrants. 1, 2, 3, 4. And so this says, find the measure of the reference angle of 110 degrees. So if we draw 110 degrees, it'll look something like this. And it's in quadrant 2. So if we remember our rule for quadrant 2, we take 180 degrees, and we subtract 110 degrees, and we get 70 degrees. So our reference angle would be 70 degrees. So now we'll try another one. And this says, find the measure of the reference angle of 265 degrees. So if we were to draw that here, it'd look like this. And it's in the third quadrant. So we take our rule from the third quadrant, and we take our 265 degree given angle, and subtract 180 degrees, and we get 85 degrees. So 85 degrees is the measure of our reference angle over here. So now that we've gone over how to find basic reference angles, we're going to focus on something that's a little bit trickier, which is finding reference angles with regards to our trig functions, so sine, cosine, tangent, and the reciprocals. And the steps for each quadrant stay exactly the same, we just have to focus on something else. And you can remember this by ASTC, or All Students Take Calc. The A is in the first quadrant, and that stands for all, because all of the trig functions are positive in this quadrant. S in the second quadrant stands for sine, because only sine is positive in this quadrant. Cosine and tangent are both negative. So the T in the third quadrant is for tangent, because tangent's positive, but sine and cosine are negative. And then the C in the fourth quadrant stands for cosine, because cosine's the only one that's positive. Sine and tangent are negative. So we just have to remember to focus on these, and we'll be able to solve some more reference angle problems. Okay, so now we'll try a couple of practice problems. And this says, write cosine of 260 degrees as a positive acute angle. If you remember, reference angles are always positive and they're always acute, so we're finding the reference angle. If we draw 260 degrees, looks about like that. And we see that it's in quadrant 3. So we take our rule from quadrant 3, and we use our given angle, 260, subtract 180 degrees, and we get 80 degrees as our reference angle. So if we go down here, you stick cosine from here in front of your degrees. And now there's one more thing that you have to remember. So because we're in the third quadrant, and tangent's only positive in this quadrant, cosine's negative, we have to make sure we stick a negative sign in front of this. You can't put it in front of the degrees because reference angles have to be positive. You have to put it in front of the cosine. And if you want to check that in your calculator, you can see that it's the same thing. So our next problem is to write tangent of 110 degrees as a positive acute angle. So if we draw 110 degrees, it's in the second quadrant. So we take our rule for the second quadrant, which is to take 180, subtract our given angle, 110, and we get 70 degrees. So we use tangent of 70 degrees, but then we have to remember, because we're in the second quadrant and tangent's negative, we have to stick a negative sign in front of it. So our answer would be negative tangent of 70 degrees. And again, you can check it in your calculator and it'll match up. So now let's review. We're going to go over the rules on how to find a reference angle in each of the 4 quadrants. In quadrant 1, your given angle and your reference angle are obviously going to be the same thing. In quadrant 2, you want to subtract your given angle from 180 degrees, and that'll give you your reference angle measurement. In quadrant 3, you take your given angle and you subtract 180 degrees from it, and that gives you your reference angle. And then in quadrant 4, you subtract your given angle from 360 degrees to get your reference angle. And then we also want to remember our trig functions. A, because everything is positive in the first quadrant. S, because only sine is positive in the second quadrant. T, because only tangent is positive in the third quadrant. And C, because only cosine is positive in the fourth quadrant. So those are all the things you really need to remember when you're solving for a reference angle. All right, so what are our 3 rules about reference angles? Number 1, they're always acute, and they're less than 90 degrees. If you get something like 110 degrees, you have to try it again, because that's wrong. Rule number 2, reference angles are always positive. It could be 60 degrees, it could be cosine cosine of 60 degrees. It could be negative cosine of 60 degrees. But if you put a negative in front of your degree measurement, it's wrong. And lastly, rule number 3, always measure from your terminal side to the x-axis, not the y-axis.